Israeli priests have not properly made known the difference between unclean and clean creatures. Ezekiel 22, verse 26. Many Messianic Hebrew roots and Jewish people who observe God's dietary commandments often rely on clean and unclean animal listings issued by various rabbinical organizations. Most clean and unclean animal listings issued by various rabbinical kosher certification organizations are identical. The prophet Ezekiel wrote that Israeli priests did not properly make known the difference between the clean animals that may be eaten and the unclean animals that may not be eaten. Leviticus 11, verse 46 through 47. Ezekiel 22, verse 26. Her priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and the clean, and they have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them. When Yeshua, Jesus, came as the Messiah, he often confronted the Jewish religious authorities, but he did not correct their errors concerning the difference between clean and unclean creatures. Jewish rabbinical authorities have not revised their clean and unclean creature classifications throughout the centuries. Therefore, it should be concluded that some of the rabbinical clean and unclean creature classifications are erroneous, according to Ezekiel 22, verse 26, and by adhering to them, believers may inadvertently be consuming some unclean creatures. Psalm 118, verse 8. It is better to trust in Yahweh the Lord than to put confidence in man. Scripture Truth Ministries does not have full faith and confidence in the clean and unclean creature classifications of mainstream Judaism's rabbinical authorities. Scripture Truth Ministries has compiled much more accurate clean and unclean creature listings, declaring many creatures that mainstream Jewish rabbinical authorities have classified clean and kosher as unclean. Mammals. Rabbinical authorities have improperly interpreted and misapplied a series of verses. Exodus 23, verse 19, 34, verse 26, and Deuteronomy 14, verse 21, and led mainstream Judaism to observe the practice of not eating mammalian meat and dairy products together. Rabbinical authorities of Judaism also permit the consumption of veal, which should be considered unclean. Exodus 23, verse 19, 34, verse 26, Deuteronomy 14, verse 21. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. The prohibition against boiling or cooking a young goat or calf in its mother's milk means not to cook and eat a calf that has not yet been weaned and is still feeding on and being nourished by its mother's milk. Genesis 18, verse 7 through 8. Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf, which he had prepared, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree as they ate. When Abraham prepared a meal for Yahweh the Lord, he took a young calf from the herd, not from its mother. So this calf had been weaned. He served this calf with butter and milk, revealing that consuming meat and dairy products together is permissible. Judaism's practice of prohibiting the consumption of meat and dairy products together is a false dietary doctrine of man. Veal calves are fed milk throughout their lives until slaughter at around 5 or 6 months of age. Judaism certifies veal as clean, kosher meat, which is an incorrect classification. The act of cooking and consuming veal is prohibited. Fish. Rabbinical authorities have improperly classified many unclean fish as clean due to a misunderstanding of the Hebrew term for fish scales, which is kaskaseth. Rabbinical authorities have determined that clean fish must possess either clinoid or cycloid scales, and if the fish is not completely covered in scales, if it only has several scales, it is still considered clean and kosher. Additionally, they proclaim that scales of clean kosher fish are removable by hand or with a knife. The Hebrew term for fish scale, kaskaseth, means the overlapping, free-shedding scales of fish that cover the bodies of fish as a coat of mail. Fish without overlapping, shedding scales covering their bodies are not clean fish. Fish with non-visible scales, embedded scales, partially scaled fish, and fish with scutes are not clean fish. Partially scaled fish, fish without scales covering their entire bodies, and fish with scutes are often infested with various parasites. Scripture Truth Ministries has determined that the following fish, among others, commonly listed as clean, kosher fish on various rabbinical fish lists, are unclean. All flatfish, grouper, jackfish with scutes, tuna, and other scombridae fish. Birds. Rabbinical authorities have improperly classified some waterfowl, ducks, geese, and swans, as clean, kosher birds. Waterfowl are listed among various Bible translations as unclean birds. Unclean waterfowls listed as unclean birds include the cormorant, heron, pelican, seagull, swan, and stork. The listing of unclean waterfowl was compiled from the New King James Version, and Tree of Life Version scriptures, Leviticus 11, 13 through 19, and Deuteronomy 14, verse 12 through 18. Ducks, geese, and swans are waterfowls that share the same characteristics as scripture-listed unclean waterfowl birds. All web-footed waterfowl are unclean. Waterfowl lack crops, a character feature requirement for clean birds used in temple animal sacrifices. Leviticus 1, verse 14 through 16. Clean birds with crops have a better digestive system, which makes their flesh more suitable for human consumption. Waterfowl swallow their food whole and have a poorer digestive system. Clean birds' fat content is confined primarily to their skin, which can easily be removed, whereas waterfowl have fat intertwined within their flesh to make them more buoyant in water. It is a dietary command to trim away animal fat and not consume it, which cannot be done with the fat intertwined greasy flesh of waterfowl. Leviticus 3, verse 17. Mushrooms. Rabbinical authorities have improperly classified edible mushrooms and other forms of fungi as clean and kosher. Mushrooms are fungi. Fungi are spore-producing organisms that feed on living or dead organic matter. Mushrooms are unclean scavengers. Truffles are also unclean fungi. Blue cheese contains mold fungi. Genesis 1, verse 29. And God said, See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree which fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Mushrooms are not vegetation, and they do not produce visible seeds. There are no scripture examples of anyone consuming mushrooms or any other fungi in scripture. Seaweed and blue-green algae. Rabbinical authorities have improperly classified seaweed and blue-green algae as clean and kosher. Seaweed, or macroalgae, refers to thousands of macroscopic, multicellular, marine algae species. Blue-green algae, also known as spirulina, are cyanobacteria that live on the surface waters of lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams. The toxins in some algae can make people sick and can be fatal for pets if ingested. Seaweed is often used in Asian cuisine, in salads, and for sushi wraps, and blue-green algae is sold as a health supplement in powder or pill form. Leviticus 11, verse 10 through 11. All in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water, or any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Leviticus 11, verse 10 through 11 applies to seaweed, blue-green algae, sea vegetation, waterfowl, and all creatures that dwell and move in and upon the waters. Seaweed and blue-green algae, whether labeled as kosher or not, are unclean. Scripture Truth Ministries is not the only entity shining a light on the errors that mainstream Judaism has made in classifying clean and unclean creatures, as others have begun to declare some creatures that have traditionally been considered clean to be unclean. Thanks to the internet, spiritual knowledge is increasing, even regarding God's true dietary commandments, in fulfillment of Daniel 12, verses 4 and 9. The gatekeepers of organized religion, false doctrines, and inaccurate information in brick and mortar churches and synagogues can no longer stop the spread of true spiritual knowledge from being received by those who hunger for and seek scripture truth in this information age. Organized religions rarely, if ever, change their false doctrinal positions and will dogmatically stand by their errors and oppose anyone who questions them. This includes organized religions' refusal to be corrected concerning God's dietary commandments. It is the responsibility of believers to make informed decisions regarding dietary choices by testing all things, all teachings, and not merely relying on the long-standing teachings of others, including rabbinical kosher certifying authorities, presuming that these authorities are accurate and infallible. According to Scripture, Ezekiel 22, verse 26, Israeli priests have not properly made known the difference between unclean and clean creatures. Thus, those who rely solely on rabbinical kosher certifying authorities to determine what creatures are clean and kosher to consume as food may be unwittingly eating some unclean creatures.